Hello and welcome back. I'm Steve Bankhead with Cayuse Commercial Services, and I'm here again with Mark Savage, consultant and CEO at StrategiX Security, to continue our conversation on the changing regulations around CMMC and 48 CFR. In this segment, we're going beyond checklists and audits to examine how systemic business risk, not just technical gaps, can derail an organization's readiness and discuss the practical steps you can take to stay compliant and contract ready. So Mark, let's jump right in. A lot of companies assume or want to believe they're exempt from CMMC because their products are 100% commercially available off the shelf, commonly known as COTS. How does that actually work in practice, and what criteria determines if that exemption really applies?
So Steve, that's a really good question. So just to clarify, we stated this in the last video and I'll state it here again. I'm sharing my thoughts as a professional consultant, right? This is not legal advice. I can't represent the role of a federal defense contract officer. And we're going to be talking the FAR and DFAR regulations. So just to make that disclaimer right up front. When we talk about commercially available off-the-shelf products, or COTS as it's commonly mentioned, we're referring to items that are broadly sold as commercial in the commercial marketplace and offered to the government without any modification, okay? Where companies, specifically in the defense industry base, tend to get tripped up is assuming that selling a commercial product automatically means they're exempt from CMMC or other security requirements such as FedRAMP, things of that nature. That's not necessarily the case. The determination depends on, one, how the product is sold, two, who it's sold to, and three, and whether that customization or is handling controlled data occurs along the path of that product, right? And that's why it's often said that COTS status isn't just a technical classification, it's really a business decision, in some cases a business risk decision. So before we delve into the regulation itself, which can be a bit of a challenge, let me zoom out for a minute, because what we're really talking about here isn't a COTS classification issue. It's part of a bigger readiness challenge, right? There are three phases that we're talking about when we're talking about CMMC. Readiness is phase one, the assessment is phase two, and certification is phase three. So we're talking about this in the context of phase one and readiness. So what we see across many organizations is an executive making decisions without full awareness of how those choices will affect the compliance obligations and business contract risks associated with FAR and DFARS and this exclusion of COTS. That's exactly why we built the Compass Readiness Framework. It's based on more than 20 years of cybersecurity consulting and compliance experience, essentially helping these same large and mid-sized organizations navigate the kinds of gray areas that we're going to be talking about here today. So where business decisions, operations, and compliance obligations intersect, we help them discover and assess these types of results. We've seen time and again that decisions made, like how a product is sort of categorized or delivered, can have a real negative downstream impact on contract eligibility and audit exposure. So with that context in mind, let's look at the regulation itself, because this is where a lot of the organizations make, I'll say, risky or poor formed assumptions about COTS exclusion. Under federal regulation FAR 2.101, which applies across all federal acquisitions, right? To claim 100% COTS exemption, one, the product must be a commercial product and, not an or, and two, it must be sold in substantial quantities in the commercial market space. And 3, it must be offered to the government without modification in the same way that you sold it you sell it to a commercial marketplace. Which means, right, if I were summarizing, no special configurations, no engineering changes, no altercations of any kind, no modification to meet government unique specifications. The product is exactly the same way you would sell it to a commercial customer, regardless of whether it's sold commercially or to the government. If you customize it in any way, it's no longer considered 100% COTS. It might still be a commercial item, but it loses that exemption status. So, for example, I've heard the argument, it's still COTS. We just configured the product to government specifications, but they can reverse that. You know, you use like a hardware or software reset. It's no longer 100% COTS, right? The reality here is if the company genuinely believes they're 100% COTS, or worse, trying to justify it to avoid compliance, which I've seen as well, the government will still hold the prime responsible for verification and validation. So ensuring what's being claimed is COTS, 100% COTS, truly meets that definition, even if the product is delivered through a subcontractor arrangement. So while they put the weight on the prime, if your subcontractor is offering that and saying it's 100% COTS, you own that responsibility to verify that and prove it, right? So what is the result of my prior statement? In serious cases, this can lead to fines, right? It could lead to clawbacks, even to False Claim Act exposure for neglect, right? Because under the False Claim Act, they don't have to prove it. They can just prove neglect. As for the services that may accompany a product, right? We hear that as well. This documentation, we're providing this professional service around it, this, that, right? They don't qualify for COTS exclusions. However, they can qualify as a commercial item under FAR Part 12, which streamlines how agencies buy them, but they don't receive the same exemption status as 100% COTS products do, right? So separate the two, keep the services unbundled, not that they can't bundle them from but keep that messaging separate, right? Product, is it 100% COTS? Can I prove it? Okay? Even though we've been referring to FAR, on the DoD side of this, the same definition applies, but CMMC essentially adds an extra layer, requiring the certification for contracts that involve FCI, right, federal contract information, or controlled unclassified information, CUI. If a contract is only 100% COTS product, CMMC doesn't apply, right? So you need to be able to verify that. But as soon as you customize it, integration, access to government data is running through, right? In this case, FCI or CUI, right? Enters that picture, the requirement comes back into scope. So you've now taken that exclusion option away. Okay? Now, it may not be your fault. You may have received government information, right? Or you may be creating that CUI, but you need to know that and you need to understand that responsibility. So bottom line, claiming 100% COTS without meeting every condition that I stated earlier creates a kind of systemic business risk, back to your earlier question, that unfortunately shows up later as audit failures or contract penalties. This is something that our staff and I and the framework help you uncover and clarify across an organization. It's only one example, but it's why we created that framework. If you're delivering anything beyond pure off-the-shelf COTS products, or if you're if you handle FCI or CUI or suspect that you may be creating that CUI in the execution of the work, you're still subject to CMMC. Okay. Level 1 applies to FCI. Okay. Well, I'm only CMMC level 1. It's FCI. That is correct. Okay. Level 2, if you're CUI, if CUI is involved here, or ITAR from a munitions perspective, and level 3, when classified data is involved.
So the lesson is, even if you get your own house in order, the risk doesn't stop there. It extends to every vendor, partner, and subcontractor you rely on. And that's where things get commercially complicated for suppliers. Many organizations depend on a broad B2B or supply chain service ecosystem to deliver their contracts. So Mark, here's my next question. When that kind of ecosystem comes into play, do FAR and DFARS obligations extend to the ecosystem when it comes to CMMC and attestation requirements? And if so, how do companies demonstrate compliance and manage it on an ongoing basis?
Yeah, Steve, absolutely. This is where things get operational, not just contractual, right? DoD is very concerned with the defense supply chain, which is the customers we're talking about here today, right? So much so that they recently published an immediate action based on a memorandum from July 18th. The memorandum, you can look it up yourself, is enhancing security protocols for the Department of Defense. That memorandum required a 15-day turnaround for compliance, specifically addressing the use of frameworks like CMMC and FedRAMP. The memo states that the DoD, and I'm pulling directly from the memo here, will not procure hardware or software susceptible to adversarial foreign influence that present mission risk. Now, that's a broad statement. Stop your buying, make sure that the products, make sure the software, make sure it's not susceptible to adversarial foreign influence. Is that people? Is that processes? Is that technology? Right? In my opinion, it aligns with a series of memos and class deviations and actions taken since 2014 when CMMC was voluntary for the DoD and U.S. government efforts to, one, and this falls under the National Defense Authorization Act, one, right, increase supply chain visibility. They want to know what you know and what you don't know, and what's going on. They want to reduce dependency on adversarial foreign sources. So quit buying or using products, software, hardware, people from North Korea, from China, from Russia, right? And if you can't prove it, which has to be auditable through your supply chain, and they ultimately want to strengthen the resiliency of the defense industrial base. So their concern right now is many subcontractors, even prime contractors, maybe utilizing products, utilizing people, utilizing processes and frameworks that the government views as risky, right, to the defense industrial base. So while the FAR and the DFARS, which you started with, doesn't explicitly tell you to maintain what I'll call a single system of record, for supply chain visibility, they both FAR and DFARS expect you to demonstrate due diligence across your entire supply chain ecosystem and maintain transparency. That means, as a prime contractor, so I'm going to focus on the prime here, but the subcontractor should understand this as well. You need to, one, validate each subcontractor's CMMC status. Okay? Know that they're eligible, right? Ensure they're eligible and compliant to that CMMC. Verify, don't expect it from them, verify their SPRS scores. You can ask for it, but you can also verify it. Manage clause flow down. So you got to keep your subcontractor agreements up to date. And if you flow it down, that's great, but you have to know what you flowing down to them and what that implication is to that subcontractor. Okay. Keep an auditable trail of all of this supply chain action. This is where having a supply chain management, service management system, having a portal for that, having the ability, to register and validate and verify, it becomes sort of self-evident, but we'll talk about that in a minute. And demonstrates you as the prime your due diligence around this whole ecosystem, around the whole model, and the supporting of CMMC. So in practice, this means having a secure, auditable supply chain management system is effectively required. Okay? I didn't say mandated, it's effectively required to comply with all the obligations, especially on DoD contracts involving CUI or FCI. Because without it, you can't demonstrate compliance when the DoD asks for evidence, and they will eventually ask for that evidence. To be clear, if your organization is only performing federal contracts with no DoD work, then only FAR applies. And we're going to be talking about that here in a minute, right? FAR versus DFAR, but you asked about both. For DoD contracts, both FAR and DFAR apply, because remember the DFARS, and we talked about this in the last video, the DFARS is a subset of the FAR. The FAR handles all federal acquisition regulations, the DFARS being the defense portion of that federal acquisitions, right? Apply. So it creates additional oversight requirements that extend into your supply chain management processes. So we're now down into your platform, the process a bit, right? I characterize the behavior as something akin, and I've said this to numerous large commercial customers and prime contractors, view this as something akin to the healthcare covered entity model, where the prime, in that model, the prime takes increased responsibility for oversight of their suppliers and vendors, right? So if you think about it and you've ever seen something related to the healthcare covered entity model, there's a business associate agreement, it's a flow down, but the prime has to maintain that BAA relationship. They have to maintain that governance. They have to maintain it. And it's mandated in the FAR regulations that they do so in healthcare. DoD is towing that line, and from my perspective, is leaning in to that same model without explicitly stating you're going to do it that way. So it's leaning, it's getting closer. These memorandums, these class deviations, these changes in these regulations are essentially putting you as the prime contractor model. Next, I should mention a few key contract regulations now that sort of shape how all this works together. They define what's responsible, really look across your entire ecosystem. And if you have or pursue a defense contract specifically, you will see these referred to in your contract vehicles, right? So none of these should really be a shock, but I'm going to state some anyways. So the first one is FAR 52204-21. That FAR regulation sets the baseline for cybersecurity. Every contractor and subcontractor has it in their is a safeguard information within their system. That's the floor everybody starts from. It's the watermark. It's the 15, depending on how you look at it, 15 or 17 cybersecurity controls. If you're dealing with FCI, it's going to be in your contract. If you're flowing it down to the subcontractor, it's going to be in there. It's the floor, right? Everybody. Then on the defense side, you now have DFARS 252-204-7012. That adds the specific protection for covered defense information. Things like CUI, things like covered controlled technical information, right? It requires you to report cybersecurity incidents. It also means, as the prime, you must make sure that the subcontractors, and it's in 7012, subcontractors are eligible, capable, and compliant. And you have to be able to prove it. Okay? 7012. The next one is DFARS 252, 204, 7020. That builds on 12, right? And ties directly to NIST 800-171, which are the security controls that you have to implement. It requires the contractors to verify and record those NIST assessments in the SPRS, in the Supplier Performance Risk System. Key, before awarding any subcontract that touches CUI, right? If your solution involves cloud services, so now we're talking Azure, GCP, AWS, right? Cloud services, or somebody running a cloud service on top of that, right? The DoD memorandum adds FedRAMP moderate equivalency requirement, okay? So now it's not just 800-171, you're now meeting 853 Rev 5 moderate controls. So what that means is you're getting an increasing number of cybersecurity controls that have to be met and an increasing number of assessment objectives by the auditor that you have to demonstrate, okay? So if you're using cloud, remember that memorandum from December of 2024 applies on top of 800-171. Then we move on to DFARS 252, 204, 7021. This is where CMMC comes in. The primes have to ensure every subcontractor has the right certification level at the time of award. So there's a window of eligibility where a sub can partner with a prime and they can propose to the government on a contract vehicle, right? They don't need to prove it until they're awarded, but they better have that before that award, because if they don't have that certification level before that award, you're going to have to change out the tires on your car. Okay? Is essentially the way I would put that. And DFARS 252, 204, 7025, that's a new number. Most people haven't heard about it, right? That recently was mentioned. That's where they add two things. In your contract, what CMMC level you have to meet. Secondly, that's where it effectively tells the prime that you now have an annual affirmation requirement, letter written, stored into SPRS, to verify from your representation that things are accurate and current. So think I view this as the chief financial officer signing off on SOX every year from a financial perspective. This is an affirmation by a senior executive in your organization, whether you're a sub, whether you're a prime. That letter has to be signed and put in, and it has to be put in by that designated individual. It can't be stuffed in there by, your operations lead, for example. It has to be, that affirmation has to be put into the system by the one that's allowed to affirm. Okay? So finally, clauses like FAR 52, 204, 10 and FAR 52, 244-2 aren't, one, they're not defense, right? They're not DFARS or FAR. Secondly, they aren't cybersecurity specific regulations per se, but they still matter. They require, under those FARs, they require you to track, register, and vet, and in some cases report on your subcontractors, right? And effectively creating that need for a system of record for transparency and accountability, okay? So if those FARs are in there, whether on federal contracts or defense or both, it sort of sets that layer. And one more layer that often surprises executives, I get the shock, the deer in the headlights look sometime when I bring this one up, is under FAR Part 31 and DFARS 252, 242, 7005. So I'm going way back to earlier DFAR numbers, right? Costs are only reimbursable or paid if they're allowable, countable, reasonable, and fully compliant with contract terms, right? So what have I just said? So if a subcontractor isn't authorized properly to perform the work, for example, let's say they lack the required CMMC level, right? The time of award, right? The prime might not be able, under that FAR and DFARS, may not be able to bill the government for that work at all. And as we know, that translates directly to sunk cost. Right? You're not going to be able to go back to the government and get paid for it. Beyond the billing issue, non-compliance can have, unfortunately, and I'm not going to use fear, uncertainty, doubt here, but can have broader consequences. If the subcontractor is non-compliant, you decide to use them, this could violate the prime's obligation under DFARS, and I mentioned it, right? It can lead to a breach of contract because that individual, that organization, if there's CUI running through it, could be a breach, right? It could trigger potential Department of Justice False Claims Act implications. We talked about this earlier, that under FCA, they just have to demonstrate, the government just has to demonstrate neglect. And these type of things would be demonstrated forms of neglect. Okay? And it would disqualify those costs from being allowed, as I mentioned earlier, right? So yes, the supply chain absolutely falls under all these requirements. I've given you a number of FAR and DFAR regulations that are going to apply here and imply the need for a strong supply chain service management model. And how you manage this can determine whether you pass an audit or face contract risks.
Mark, that's a lot to take in. But to me, the critical point is it's not just about your own compliance. It's about the readiness of everyone you depend on. So when you look at both sides of this, whether it's how you classify your products or how you manage your supply chain, the same principles apply. So for executives, what are some practical steps they can take to strengthen their company's readiness?
Yeah, that's, to be honest, that's the part I enjoy the most. I like to take the problem, as we've outlined it and turn it into something practical and essentially move that needle in a positive way, right? So from a readiness, back to phase one, remember I mentioned there are 3 phases of this, back to the readiness standpoint in this. Here are a few, I'll call them practical recommendations, right? So clarify ownership. Assign a single executive owner for supply chain compliance, not just for IT compliance, not just for procurement reasons. I don't care if it's somebody that already has oversight of your portal and your supply chain service management. Maybe assign your public sector or government service business owner, but put one belly button in charge of the compliance around this that you need for federal and defense contracts, right? And meeting this. Secondly, centralize the visibility. Maintain one auditable system of record that tracks the subcontractor's status, flow down clauses, and the CMMC level, right? One thing I've seen is that many of these were built as commercial B2B supply chain models and have no designated categories or coverage for what we've been talking about here around government or federal compliance data points. Secondly, I've seen a lot of these supply chain models that were built organically over time and are glued together and they're distributed pieces of it all over the organization. Get it pulled together. Even if you leave it distributed as an architecture, get the visibility, get the auditability, get the transparency centralized, right? Get it as a single point, single source of truth and a system of record. Third, I'd say verify continuously. Don't wait for a contract renewal, to validate your subcontractor's compliance and their status, right? Don't just send out questionnaires and wait for 60 days and hope you get a response, right? Make sure the responsibility and accountability goes where it needs to in this model, right? Like the SPRS score. Don't wait annually, right? Ask for it quarterly, check up on it, right? Create triggers. And I'd say, yes, this is a really good place where AI tools can help you. Okay? So there's a lot of AI for every day of the week. There's a lot of AI in every security tool out there, right? Everybody will market it to you. But in reality, this is a business context challenge. This is the B2B model, sales and marketing, invoice and finance, service management, operations. They're all different systems. They're all over the place. This is your opportunity to actually utilize AI tools and help you not just automate it, but really learn about what's going on in your supply chain. And we can help them in this regard. Okay. Lastly is document your decisions. Keep a clear record of every verification, exception, substitution that you make. I made the earlier comment, you got to change out the tires on your car, right? This is the keep up with the changing the tires, rotating the tires, doing what you're doing. From my perspective, it's your best defense in an audit. If you don't have that if you don't have that traceability, if you don't have the context of why something's changing across that ecosystem, from a compliance, I'll call it a registration process, a verification process, a validation. If you don't have those built in to all those different pieces of the B2B model, then you're going to have a problem proving it from an audit perspective. These aren't just operational steps that we're talking about here, right? These are leadership practices. These are governance practice, right? These demonstrate your due diligence to CMMC and to FedRAMP and to other compliance regulations around this, right? And it demonstrates your supply chain with resiliency, right? So this doesn't become a contract risk, a contract issue later.
Well, thanks, Mark. You've covered a lot of ground there for everyone to take and consider. But it was a clear breakdown of some of the complex compliance issues and how changing government regulations affect all companies with federal and defense contracts.
Steve, I'm always glad to help. Compliance isn't just sort of managing systems, documentation, or data. It's really a series of leadership decisions about how you manage your business and essentially manage your contract risk involving these federal and defense contracts.
It's important to remember compliance readiness isn't a one-time project. It's an ongoing business discipline. The earlier you start aligning your contracts, teams, and supply chain partners, the stronger your position will be when new regulations come into play. While a commercial B2B supply chain system makes for a good foundation, FAR and DFARS have specific requirements, as Mark's outlined today. And we partner with our clients to make sure they meet these regulations, not only initially, but have the discipline to maintain operational readiness. Thanks for listening. And if you have any questions and would like us to cover in a future session, please send them to questions@strategicsecurity.com. And if you'd like to start a conversation and get some clarity on your organization's readiness, schedule a 30-minute call with Mark, and it's free, focused discussion to expose your current readiness posture, talk through the risk you are managing today, and pinpoint what's most important for your organization moving forward. To schedule a call, scan the QR code on the screen or visit strategicsecurity.com/schedule. You can also contact me at sbankhead@cayusecs.com. Thanks for joining us today. And next time, we'll dig into why no single firm should take you from zero to certified. We'll show you who's part of the process and how it comes together. Thanks for joining.
Thank you, Steve.